Hi, Gary Stearman. Time for another update from Prophecy Watchers. In studio with us today is author, lecturer, and global traveler Carl Teichrib. Carl, welcome to Prophecy Watchers.
Thank you. Good to be with you today.
Now, Carl is here because we've been interviewing him about his new book. It's called Game of Gods, and it's over 500 pages in length. But don't let that frighten you because you don't have to read it all at one time. The thing is, it's a compendium. Carl, you are a researcher, but you are a very special kind of researcher. You do a lot of travel, right?
I do, yes.
And where do you travel?
I go to places that the average Christian won't. So I go to global governance events, World Federalists and United Nations styled events, and I've been to the United Nations to different conferences, different summits. I go to interfaith events. I go to where the culture is changing, like Burning Man. I even attend pagan
Burning
conferences.
Man. You mentioned Burning Man.
Right.
A lot of people might not know what Burning Man is.
It's one of the most influential cultural trend-setting gatherings in the United States. In fact, so much so that in 2018, the Smithsonian dedicated its entire Renwick Gallery to documenting and displaying Burning Man culture.
Wow.
It's really the unofficial United Nations of Silicon Valley, and it is a place where culture is shaped.
And it meets in the desert.
And it meets in the desert of northern Nevada. Roughly 70,000 people.
So it's kind of a camp meeting.
Oh my, it's, yes.
But you visit places like this. You find out what's going on for us who are engaged elsewhere, and we wouldn't have the time or the inclination or even the knowledge of where to go. Carl does that traveling for us, does a lot of research, and his research ends up in this book, Game of Gods, showing us exactly what's going on today, and you would be very surprised to find out what it is.
Well, you know, right now, as we're talking, the big discussion point in especially your nation's politics is the Green New Deal, and all the talk about how we have to restructure America's economy, how we have to restructure your behaviors, everything to fit this new Green Deal, which is really a socialist Marxist type of program, overlaid with environmental language.
But if you say green, that's kind of innocuous. The greening of America or the greening of the world. You want to
sounds good, doesn't it?
You want to have lots of kale. You want to have good vegetables. You want to preserve the atmosphere. You want to keep the oceans from rising. And the first thing you know, you're talking about global economy and global ecology. And if you don't do the right things, you are a sinner, right?
Right, exactly. And it's pretty intense. The language can get very intense. One section of the book that I have is a subsection entitled Fade to Green. And if you want to understand where these ideas are coming from, the new Green Deal and the environmental messages that's taking place in your schools, Earth Day.
Yeah.
I bust all that down for you and allow you to see the backside, the real context.
Behind the curtain.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I mean, it took a lot of time. A book like this and the type of work being done here, this is intensive. For you to go and do it, for anybody else to go and do it, you'd be following 25 years of work to wrap up everything that's within the cover of this book. And so there's a lot of context. And the Green New Deal, for me, is as we're looking at how America is changing, that's just one of those major indicators, but it's not a standalone thing. It fits within the context of what we talk about in Game of Gods.
Your book is amazing, I have to say. Page 366, perhaps we will find there is no other alternative to a system of rigid controls that some would equate to a police state. Now here you're talking about just environmental regulations.
Right. That was from a document set which describes the need for a global green constitution and was one of the events that preceded a major United Nations conference on the earth and on ecology. And this is something I help people understand. These kinds of events, what we're talking about here, they're not standalone. This isn't happening out of a vacuum. There's a history, there's context, there's meaning. There are movements and people engaged in this, and they're serious.
And we see
Very
them on
serious.
American television.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of people standing up for the green movement today. I'm not going to name names. I'm sure you've seen them yourself. And going into the next election cycle, green is going to be a big topic.
Absolutely.
But it's more than just ecology. And this is, you really go to some length to point out that, wait a minute, the green movement is not just about the physical earth and maintaining a good balance of carbon dioxide and making sure that it rains enough and so forth and so on. It's something else. It has a religious
Does it
connection.
ever? Does it ever? I really bust that down when I take a look at Earth Day, because Earth Day is, well, let's face it, it's one of the largest religious celebrations that we all do around the world together. And so I go through the history of that, demonstrating how in 1970, the very first Earth Day happened in 1970, April 22nd, 1970, as a national teach-in in the United States. And attached to that national teach-in was a book, a handbook called the Environmental Handbook. And teachers, professors took this environmental handbook and used it in their classrooms. Millions of Americans use this text. And what's interesting is in the very beginning of it, it lays the blame for our environmental problems at the feet of Christianity. And says, unless we have a new religion to replace the old Christian axiom, we'll continue to have a worsening ecological crisis. And then towards the back of the book, literally has a list, and I talk about that and give you the details of it in my own book. Gives you a list of acceptable religious practices. And again, this is 1970, and so I bring that into the book. But what's so important is this helps us understand why there's such a religious fervor with the environmental movement today.
Wow.
Because it is.
Overconsumption is I suppose, the sin above all sins today. And I was thinking as you were talking, what do we Christians celebrate? Thanksgiving. The Lord provides, and we have the full table on Thanksgiving. And we thank the Lord for His blessing that we can experience this. And Christmas is a similar holiday. And out of this has come the great criticism that you Christians are abusing the world by scooping in all of the good stuff and planting seeds and ruining the economy and the ecology, and they can make us the enemy.
We are the bad guys.
The bad guys.
I actually take the time to go through 4 Christian responses to the environmental question. And I'm not going to go through that in our little interview time right now, but they can go through the book and see 4 Christian responses. One of them is for us to hide our heads in the sand. We've been really good at that. The other response is we actually need to challenge those assumptions. We need to challenge the assumptions that are being put before us by the culture. Is it really true? The other thing we need to do, though, too, Gary, and this is important, is recognize that there is a biblical understanding of how nature and humanity works, recognizing that there's value in nature because of who made it. And that's important.
And we Christians believe something that the world is finding difficult to believe, and that is that God will bless your crops. He will bless your livestock. He will bless your property in tangible ways if you acknowledge Him and worship Him, and He's promised to bless. And that blessing in and of itself would be considered almost a sin. Overconsumption.
You know, we cannot forget as Christians that the earth, the cattle, the hills, everything, ultimately, all of it is God's.
Yeah. True. And so you have attended how many meetings? I mean, just a rough idea over the...
So, golly, somewhere 35 to 40, maybe somewhere in that neighborhood, 35 to 40. So I've been going so that you don't have to. I've been going so that the average person doesn't have to.
And I'm glad you did, because
well, thank you.
I really am. Because when I read Game of Gods, basically Carl was blowing the whistle on these people, putting things out where you can see what they're doing right now. And there are many mysterious things, like, do you really understand the green movement? And you see people on TV or right now extolling the virtues of the green movement. How much do you know about the green movement? I would absolutely recommend this book, Game of Gods, because in it you're going to find the behind-the-scenes motives of the people in the Green movement.
You know, what this book does is it presents a warning, but at the same time, it does give us a bit of a blueprint, too, as to how we as Christians need to respond to the world around us. And I'm hoping people will use this as a launching pad to talk to their neighbors, to talk to their friends and family, because everybody's asking the question, how do we get to this point? How do we get here? We as Christians are good at complaining about that.
Yeah.
We are. Now let's actually dive into that. How do we get there? And then let's look at some of the hard issues and recognize that what the world is presenting is an alternative redemption story when we have the biblical account of Jesus Christ and the salvation that he affords. Who ultimately do you trust? The game of gods that we're all playing? Or do you trust the one God, the only God, the true God?
When I first finished reading Game of Gods, my response was, this is the longest prayer list I've ever read. It's 500 plus pages of prayer requests. Carl goes behind the scenes, he discovers what's going on, and your first reaction as a Christian is to say, oh Lord, teach me how to pray for this thing, because it's coming and it's dark and we need to stand against it. And again, this is our mission in life.
We're ambassadors for Christ. Let's take that seriously.
Amen. His name is Carl Teichrib. The book, Game of Gods. You'll be hearing more about it right here on Prophecy Watchers. So you keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter, or follow us at facebook.com/prophecywatchers. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.